If you're having boring conversation with girls, there's probably one of three things going on. Either you are running out of things to say, or you're asking a bunch of boring, lame questions, or you are on conversation topics that are just dry and platonic and going nowhere. And all of those are very easily solvable. But the first thing you need to understand, the first thing you need to do if you want to stop having boring conversations is you need to decide that you will never again be bored in a conversation. There was a principle in sort of game lore years and years ago, which was very prevalent. It was called self-amusement. The idea of you being amused, you having fun in your own conversation. And that's a very, very good idea. The problem with that philosophy was it led guys to go too far. It led guys to become a little clownish, a little cartoony, a little over the top, a little bit try-hard. And so I would take that down a notch, but still keep it. Instead of self-amusement, what I want to go for is self-engagement. Okay? You don't have to be putting on a show. You don't have to be a clown act. You don't have to be getting a laugh every 10 seconds. What you do need to be is engage in your own conversation. If you feel your brain switching off in the middle of the conversation, that's a problem. If you feel yourself about to yawn, it's a problem. And if that happens, do what you need to change it. Do not worry about it being a smooth transition. Do not worry about it fitting in naturally with the conversation. In almost every area of game, the most important thing going on is, does the interaction have what it needs? That matters a lot more than whether that's occurring smoothly. So a lot of guys, if the girl's droning on about her shoe collection and he's bored and she's bored, they'll just be like, well, I don't see a good opportunity to interrupt. I don't know what to do. I'm just going to let this conversation wind itself out. And the girl's, okay, nice to meet you. Bye. Set over. Interrupt. It's okay to interrupt. It's not actually nearly as rude to interrupt as you might think, especially if your interruption is tangential. But even if it's not, if you just interrupt with an interesting idea, fine. So she's talking about her shoe collection. You know what I just realized the other day? And just start talking. Interrupt and talk about what you really want to. If you really, really had to, you could even point out that the topic is boring. It would be better than letting that boring topic run. You'd be like, you know what? You and I are way too interesting to be talking about a shoe collection. I would much rather know about this, right? You need to make that commitment to not be bored. That commitment that you'd rather make things slightly socially awkward, which they're about 2% going to be anyway, but you'd rather make things a little bit socially awkward than to tolerate that boring conversation. If you're bored, she's probably bored, and boredom isn't getting any of you anywhere. So with that out of the way, let's deal with the first case of boring conversation, which is, I ran out of things to say. I don't know what to say. The fact of the matter is you didn't actually run out of things to say. You're never going to run out of things to say because I guarantee you if you're old enough to be understanding this video, you have at least decades of life experience and you have tons of things to say. And when you're around your good friends, you don't run out of things to say in some nervous way that kills the conversation. You just keep talking. Or even if there's an awkward silence, it's not even awkward because you're cool with it. So you don't run out of things to say in context where you are comfortable. You run out of things to say in contexts where you're not comfortable. You don't run out of things to say in contexts where you feel you're a leader. You tend to run out of things to say in contexts where you're unsure of the validity or the value of what you have to say. And here's the thing. When you're silent in a conversation and you're racking your brain for what to say, you think that you're trying to come up with something to say, but your brain disagrees. Your brain is working against you because your brain is the product of millions of years of evolution, and one of the primary things it's trying to do is avoid a social misstep. It's trying to avoid embarrassing itself. And so when you're saying, I have to come up with something to say, your brain's saying, no, shut up, shut up, shut up. As long as you're silent, you can't make an ass of yourself. If you were to just start talking, if you were to be mid-sentence, all of a sudden, your brain's motivation would change. Your brain would be like, oh shit, I'm talking and people are paying attention. I better finish the sentence. And now all of a sudden, the floodgates will open. Because now, instead of your brain working against you and trying to keep you from talking, your brain is going to help you to talk. So the secret here is just start to say anything. And I'll give you a couple formats that are really, really good ways to start. Let's say that there's been general conversation going on and there's a little bit of a lull, you don't know what to say. Just say yes and then finish that sentence. And you will figure out how to finish the sentence. You will say something. Or if someone just finished and there's that pregnant pause, you go yes and finish whatever comes out of your mouth. And I promise you'll be fine because now your brain's working for you. The other thing to realize with everything I talk about in this video, the threshold for conversation is not nearly as high as you might think. If you're in a bar talking to girls, for example, you're being compared to the next drunken idiot. If you're talking to girls on the street, you're being compared to the next overly nervous guy who can barely stammer out a sentence to her, okay? Whatever you say is going to be good enough, especially if you say it with conviction and with confidence, which we'll get to in a minute. So just start the sentence. Again, yes and is a great way to start. Here's another great way to start. I love ... Figure it out. Whatever's going to come afterwards, you're going to express a strong opinion, and that's going to be something interesting. Or I hate ... Now you're expressing a strong opinion and you're being polarizing. In this first case of using the words yes and, it's hard to dislike you because you're agreeing and adding something of value. I agree, and here's my own little contribution. Who's going to dislike that person? When you say I love or I hate, you're sharing a unique perspective. You're offering something new, something of value to the conversation. And whether the girl agrees or disagrees, now there is something to talk about. And now you've expressed your personality a bit more. Beyond that, you've been a leader. Potentially, you've been polarizing. These are great formats you can use anytime there's nothing on the table to say. But the key thing is just say anything. Just trust what comes out of your mouth, because if it is a long, pregnant silence, you know where that ends. It ends with nice to meet you and goodbye. So anything you do is better than that, right? Letting the conversation just go dead has a 100% failure rate. Anything is better than that, so just say something. And again, those formats, yes and, I love, I hate, are very safe formats to get you started on the path to something that will be interesting and value offering and will continue the conversation. The next form of lame, boring conversation is the interview mode conversation, where you're just asking the girl a series of lame, boring questions. And first of all, let's talk about why questions generally are not good. When you're asking questions, you're not providing new information to the conversation. You're asking and hoping that the girl will provide the new interesting information, and oftentimes she won't. And even if she is providing interesting information, it's interesting information she already knew. She already knows her answers to basic biographical questions. So when she's answering these things, she's not learning anything new from it. It's not an interesting conversation to her. Now, are there good questions? Yes, it is possible to have good questions. If the question is insightful in some way or provokes thought in some way, it could potentially be a good question. So if you were to ask, instead of the question, what do you do for a living? If you were to say something like, you seem like a really professional person, but at the same time like someone who would hate being behind a desk. So I have to ask, what do you do for a living? That's a much better question. That's actually a good question now, because in asking that question, you've actually given a lot of value. You've given a lot of interpretation of who the girl is, a lot of insight into your own thoughts about her and what her job could be. And so now it's no longer a value-taking question, it's a value-offering question. So if you can learn to ask questions in a value-offering way, they can actually become much, much, much better, and now the conversation is no longer anywhere near as boring. Another way to make your questions more interesting is to sort of answer the question instead of asking it. So instead of asking a question like, where are you from? You say something like, you don't seem like you're from London. Or you seem like you would have come from like a small town based on the way you carry yourself. Something like that. Again, now instead of just asking the question, you're giving a perspective, you're giving insight, you're giving information in the question. You're actually sort of making a guess about her, or we call it like almost like a cold read about her, into asking the question. And now the question itself has some value offering characteristics. Even with these value offering characteristics, you would usually be better off making an assertion or a statement rather than asking a question. But there are times when a question can be really good, especially if it's a follow-up. If the girl's already talking about something she seems into or seems passionate about, and if you get her to elaborate on it and continue talking about that by your question, that actually can be a very, very valuable question in its own right. But let's say that you have asked a boring question. That's not great, but you may survive. If you ask 2 boring questions, it's starting to be bad. If you ask 3 boring questions, usually that is the end. Usually it's over at 3. And how do I know this? Because on bootcamp after bootcamp, I break down in-field footage of students who are talking to girls and asking too many questions, and invariably, or it seems like invariably, it's on that 3rd question it ends. First question, girl's a little bit bored. Second question, girl's barely tolerating. Third question, nice to meet you. But let's stop it way before 3. Let's stop it at 1 if we can. As soon as you ask that first boring question and she responds, I want you to make a commitment that the next thing out of your mouth will be value offering. And you have 2 options. One is just value offering, having an opinion, having a perspective, telling a story, an anecdote, something like that. Or the even better option, which is a tease. And there's a great exercise for practicing this, something I do on bootcamp, I do with my students, is called question, answer, tease. Practice, you say, boring question, what do you do for a living? She says her job, come up with a tease about it. What do you do for a living? Different job, come up with a tease for it. Practice this, get good at it. But it doesn't even have to be a tease, because teases sometimes can be hard. What do you do for a living? I'm a nurse. Oh, that's so interesting. I had an aunt who was a nurse and she did this and this and this. She told me this. Is that true? Now you've given some perspective, given some insight. And I did actually end that with a question, but I gave a lot more perspective. I gave a lot more value before getting to that next question. And as a side note, it would have been even better if I hadn't ended it with a question. So as far as the questions, first of all, try and avoid asking questions, make statements in the first place. Secondly, if you are going to ask questions with insight. Ask questions that convey your personality even as you're asking the question. And if you do find yourself down that string of boring questions, cut it as soon as possible. Ideally, cut it at the first one. Definitely cut it at the second one, because once you get to that third boring question, it's uncanny how often that third boring question is the nice to meet you goodbye. Finally, we have boring conversation topics. And in order to talk about boring conversation topics, we should first talk about what are interesting conversation topics. Where would you like the conversation to go? Obviously, there are some topics that lead more towards intimacy and sex than others. Talking about sex, romance, intimacy, taking risks, all of those are great topics. One of the best category topics in general is talking about the girl. Everybody is interested in themselves, even if they're not interested in you very much. So if you have an opinion about them that might reflect on how their life's going to play out or how other people are perceiving them, even if they don't actually care about your opinion, they probably care about the them aspect of your opinion. They want to know about themselves, and so they will want to know more. Even better topic, though, than talking about the girl, if you can, is talking about you and the girl together. And that's why it's so important to get to the point, make your intentions clear, and make it man to woman during the course of the conversation. Because as soon as you indicate that it is a man to woman conversation, as soon as you indicate that what's on the table is, are we going to get together or not? Anytime you reach a boring point in the conversation, you have one kind of meta topic that you can always go back to, which is the topic of you and her. And any boring conversation can be brought back to you and her with, oh, that's why we're going to break up. Oh, that's why I like you. Oh, you gained a point for that. Wow, sweetie, this is why we can't have nice things. You can keep bringing topics back to that and making them interesting even if they were inherently boring. So getting to the point and making it man to woman will make the conversation topic interesting even when the conversation topic itself is inherently boring. You can also, in the middle of boring conversation topics, interrupt with teases or things that are on point or sort of more gamey and on purpose, even if they're a little out of context. If she's talking about her shoe collection and you just break and say, you know what? You just look so adorable just then. I can't even stand it. Anyway, go back. What were you saying? Well, now what have I just done? I've made it relevant and I've made it man to woman again. Now you can dispute whether that's the absolute perfect line or not, but it's certainly a lot more interesting than whatever boring topic was going on before it. And now I've made the conversation itself refocused, interesting again, and relevant again. And I kind of mentioned this at the top, but I want to really mention it here. It is absolutely okay to interrupt. If there's a boring conversation going on and you interrupt it with something more interesting, she's probably going to be happy and relieved as much as you are. Even if she's not, at least you're having a conversation that has a chance of going somewhere rather than a chance of going nowhere. So if she's drifting to boring conversation topics, please nudge the conversation back in the right direction. And definitely, and this is very critical because guys do this all the time, don't voluntarily steer it to boring conversation topics yourself. A lot of guys do this because they're nervous around tension. They're nervous around sexual tension. They're nervous around a moment of awkwardness. And actually, tension and awkwardness can be good for a game. But a lot of guys, they'll have a moment when there's a nice man-to-woman moment. There's a little bit of sexual tension. It's actually really good. And because the guy's a little nervous, they'll be like, so the weather's been really, there's been a lot of weather this last week. And all of a sudden, you're back onto boring topics. So it's bad enough if you let the girl steer it onto boring topics and you don't do anything about it, but it's worse yet if you take it to boring topics yourself. Don't you dare do that. One of the best ways to interrupt seamlessly is actually an exercise I teach what I call vibing. And it mimics that really great conversation you have with your friends where you stay up all night talking, and if someone asks what was the conversation about, you're like, I don't know, it just went everywhere. And the way this works is as the girl's talking, you can do this regardless of the conversation topic, but especially if the conversation topic is a bit boring, you're looking for a chance to jump in on a tangential topic. So if she's talking about the weather, for example, you could jump in with a conversation about the crazy storm you saw on your trip to Thailand and how you had to run for your life and you were terrified that you weren't going to make it. Now you've taken something about the weather, what you did was related kinda, but you made it much more interesting. Or if she's talking about clothing, you can talk about the funny thing that happened when your boss came in on Casual Friday, but it wasn't actual Casual Friday and he was embarrassed and etc., right? So basically, whenever someone's talking, if an idea strikes you of something interesting, don't be shy about interrupting with it and going with it, right? Don't be shy about saying the thing that popped into your head. If you're with your good friends who you're comfortable with, you probably would do just that. If you start acting around the girl you just met the way you do with your good friends, you're going to have these rich, crazy, spontaneous conversations that go everywhere and feel like you have that deep connection. So it's absolutely okay to interrupt in general, but it's really awesome actually to interrupt on a tangent. To interrupt in a way that says, I was paying attention to you, something sparked my interest, I felt comfortable enough to say this and to share and offer my value. That's a great way to communicate, and it's very, very interesting. So I've given you a whole bunch of techniques, but I want to bring you back to where we started, which is this. If you're having boring conversation topics, number one, it's your fault. The burden is on you to make it interesting. All the techniques are great, but the most important thing is for you to make that decision not to be bored. If you find your brain switching off, do what you have to switch it back on, even if it's not perfect game. If I had a choice between doing some line that I've heard a million times and said a million times and works, but it's boring me while saying it, to saying something new and interesting that keeps me engaged, I will actually get better results in game by saying the thing that's bad game, or at least not good game, but that keeps me engaged and present, than by saying the thing that is traditionally good game but turns my brain off. Staying self-engaged, again, not self-amused, not like a clown, but self-engaged is absolutely critical. So you can think all day about what kind of topics are interesting to her, and we already talked about that a bunch during the course of this video, but the most important fundamental is at least talk about something that's not boring to you. So that's today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. And little side note, once upon a time, because I'm very technical about things and not so crazy, not clownishly self-amusing, I was once known as the boring coach, or the guy who did boring game. So if you think I'm boring, comment below and let me know just how boring you think I am. Also, if you have appreciation for the video or thoughts on anything I said, love to hear that as well. Okay, that's it. See you on the next one. Bye.